When the Night Comes Out presents The Hive, Part 7. Q ran down the hall, cursing under his breath. He could still see, in his mind's eye, the zombies as they tore apart the guards all around him back in the medical lab. Every sound made him jump. He had to get himself under control. He always maintained control. He focused, pushing the images aside, literally imagining him pushing the images out of the way of his sight and away into the archives of his brain. "Okay," he said to the 10 guards who had joined him. "We just need to get this entire wing cleared as fast as possible. Get the prisoners to the cafeteria. If any of them tries anything, just shoot them. Got it?" The guards nodded their heads. They reached the far end and opened the cell. They saw blood and torn clothing. They also saw that the vent, set high in the ceiling, was gone. The cell was empty. "Shit," Q said. "This is hopeless. Keep moving. Move fast." They moved to the next cell. This time, they found what looked like body parts and intestines, with blood splattered across the walls and ceiling, but nothing else. Another open air vent. The next one was also empty. When they opened the third, they all froze. The cell was packed with demons with red eyes and slobbering on themselves. One of them held the arm of the prisoner whose cell it was, clenched between its spiked teeth. The arm was not attached. "Open fire," Q ordered. "Aim for the heads." The cell filled with gunfire. The ghouls let out a unified scream, and one after another fell. 2 managed to get back into the air shaft. "Move to the next cell, fast," Q said. The group ran to the next cell and opened the door. The prisoner inside looked terrified. "There's things at the walls," he yelped. "Get me the fuck out of here." "Get out," Q ordered, pointing with his gun. "Get out now and head to the cafeteria. Move." The prisoner leapt from the bed and bolted towards the guards. Just then, the air vent covering exploded inward. The wall itself seemed to bulge. Q watched in horror as the toothy faces of the ghouls filled the opening. Q opened fire into those faces. More hideous screeches from the beasts filled his ears. "Keep going," Q yelled and waved frantically. "Don't wait, just move. Get as many out as you can. Shoot anything that comes through the air vents." Q slammed the cell door shut just as more of the ghouls fell through the open air vent. He heard those screams from inside, and the door rattled in its frame. Q wiped a hand across his forehead and moved on to the next one. "Let this be over soon," he muttered. Reg ran with a crew of about 30. In his ear was Kettinger, telling him where he needed to go. He huffed and puffed, his lungs working overtime in the humid air. What he knew for sure was that the monsters were moving fast. "Right here," Reg said, pointing to the metal vent in the ceiling. They were at a junction, and it looked like a metallic cross set into the ceiling overhead. "Get up there and weld the metal plate into that shaft. Move!" His men did as told. They were up there with a ladder, through the metal, and welding the other metal sheet into place in 30 seconds. Reg broke out in a cold sweat. He could feel these creatures, whatever the hell they actually were, up there, crawling through the vents, working their way closer to them all. They had to move faster. "Will it hold?" he yelled. "I've no idea, boss," the man holding the welding torch said. "I don't know how strong these things are." Reg had to agree that this whole plan was a wild shot in the dark. They had burst through the metal in the hospital, so there was nothing saying that the new welds would hold. The metal they were welding was the same stuff as the shaft itself, so who knew? "Reg, you gotta move, buddy," Kettinger said in his ear. "We gotta go, guys," Reg ordered. They ran off, on to the next mission. Up ahead, one of the guards screamed. Q turned his head and saw the demons pouring out of one of the cells, jumping and leaping like wild animals into the group of guards. "Shoot!" he screamed. Everyone shoot at them! Go for the heads! Q raised his own rifle, aiming for the heads, and took 2 out. However, the stream of them kept pouring out from the cell. They knew, Q thought. He had no idea where the idea came from, but it was suddenly a certainty in his own mind. Somehow they knew that Reg and his crew were sealing off the air vents. They were pouring out of the cell in a flood. The guards fired, but they were so close, and there were so many of them, that they were hitting the ghouls in the chest, stomach, legs, anywhere but the head. Q saw one of the prisoners that they had rescued try to join the fight, but he was quickly enveloped by arms and hands and pulled into the mass of creatures. A piercing scream filled the air that quickly turned into a sickening gurgling sound. Q strode forward, firing and firing and firing into the mass of swirling undead bodies. He saw 3 of his guards dragged off into the cell as the ghouls retreated. He eventually reached the cell from which they had emerged and saw the remaining ghouls retreating into the air vent. "Get to the next cell," Q called out, his jaw set in determination. "Move." He had to keep them going, keep them focused. They had just lost 3 more of their own. The emotions would be hitting hard, and that would cause them to lose focus. Q was having enough trouble focusing on his own. They went to the next cell, the sound of feet and bodies from the air shaft filling the air inside. The terrified prisoner ran out the moment they opened the door. The same thing happened in the next cell. By the time they reached the next cell, the sounds of the scrambling ghouls in the air shaft was silent. The same was true in the next cell. Then they opened the next cell and saw only blood and organs again. "What the hell?" Q said, out of breath from their scramble. "I thought we got ahead of..." There was a huge sound as something collapsed up ahead. It seemed to come from all around them. Then came the high-pitched screaming sound. Q turned around and saw that the hall was filled with ghouls from the cells they had cleaned out. He had forgotten to close the door behind them. Up ahead, the guards were opening another door just ahead of them. It all clicked in Q's head. The ghouls had broken into 2 groups, and one had moved ahead of the other. Those 2 groups were now merging in the middle. "Wait!" Q yelled at the team getting set to open the next cell door. Too late. The cell door opened. The ghouls poured out again, only this time they numbered almost 100. Behind them, the ghouls let out their screech again. Q turned back and saw above 100 more behind them. And these creatures were running. Reg could hear gunfire, and he did his best to put it out of his mind. He had to focus on what he was doing, and they were almost done. However, he knew that Q and his men were trying to get prisoners out, and it was obvious they had run into trouble. They reached another junction. Reg took up a position with his rifle, while the welding team got into the air shaft. The bright welding tool lit up the hallway for a few minutes. There were screams now, down the hall. Reg tensed on the trigger, sweat pouring down his head. He wanted to help. His men were dying, or worse. "Let's get this done and see if we can help," Reg said as the team emerged from the air shaft. "We've got one more." Kettinger talked in Reg's ear, guiding them to the last junction. This time, it was inside a prisoner's cell. Reg and his men went in. Reg guarded the hall, while another guard held the prisoner at gunpoint. The prisoner, meanwhile, looked too terrified to put up much resistance. "Don't try anything," the guard holding the gun on the prisoner said. "Are you fucking kidding me?" the prisoner replied. "Why the hell would I want to go out there?" The welding team finished and backed out of the cell. "Mike, I need to go help Q and his people," Reg said. "They're getting slaughtered over there." There was a long pause. Reg knew that Kettinger was worried about losing him to the battle and whatever these creatures were, but Kettinger also knew that he was the best person for the job. "Go, but be careful," Kettinger said. The team formed up behind Reg, and they moved toward the end of the hall. The sounds of fighting and firing were coming from the left branch of the junction. There was a small explosion, as if someone had thrown a grenade, and debris scattered into the T-junction ahead. Reg raised his weapon. Then, suddenly, the end of the hall was filled with swarming bodies. Some of them were the zombie things, but some of them were guards and prisoners. All of them were fighting. The zombies were clawing and grabbing and gnashing the air with their teeth. The guards were firing into them as best they could, but the close quarters were making it tough to get headshots with their rifles. Reg saw that more of his guards were now ghouls. They seemed to have dropped their rifles and commenced with the biting. The prisoners were fighting with their bare hands, or with shivs that Reg knew they weren't supposed to have. Right now, however, he was glad that prisoners were prisoners no matter where or what the prison was. Reg stopped, aimed, fired, and took down one of the ghouls with a shot to the head. This allowed the guard to get his own rifle up and send a burst into the head of the nearest zombie thing in front of him. The thing's head burst apart like rotten fruit. There were more hideous, inhuman screams from behind where Reg was. He whirled and gasped as one of the cells opened and more of the zombies poured out into the hall. One of his former guards led the way. The ghouls turned left and right and then charged down the hall, soon joining the battle. Reg fired into the oncoming group. 3 of them were headshots, and they went down fast, causing more of them to go sprawling. They were on Reg's group in minutes, and 2 of his men were quickly overwhelmed, their screams filling the air as the teeth found soft flesh and bit and tore. Reg forced himself to stay calm, aiming and firing one shot. He had taken sniper training on the surface when he was in the army and knew the one-shot, one-kill strategy that they had. He hadn't quite had the skills to become a sniper, but he tried to rely on the training, regulating his breath, taking aim, squeezing the trigger. Where had they all come from? Reg wondered. There were so many now. How fast was the virus, or whatever the hell it was, working now? It was getting stronger. It was then Reg knew that metal plates were not going to stop these things. They were too strong and seemed to have gotten physically stronger once they turned into whatever the hell they were now. Zombies, Reg thought. These fuckers are zombies. "We need to get out of here," Reg yelled. "Retreat and head back to admin." They were going to have to shut down this entire wing of the prison. There were thick iron doors that would prevent these things from getting elsewhere, and maybe those metal plates would give them a little time to figure out how to more properly block off the air shafts. Of course, his words had little effect. They all knew the score. They knew they were being overwhelmed, but there was nothing else they could do. They fought. Reg could not find Q. He found more of his guards, and soon they had formed a rough group that bristled with rifles. In the middle were the prisoners that they could get out of their cells. "Where the hell is Q?" Reg asked. He got shrugs in return. They moved as a group, heading for the exit, to where the doors could slam shut on this nightmare. Firing and blasting, bullet casings littering the floor as they went. The ghouls just kept coming, some of them bursting out of cells that should have been locked down. Reg fired and fired, changed magazines, and fired again, praying for the best. Q had gotten separated when the charge happened. He had run back down the hall, deeper into the prison. He was now almost back to the medical wing, and he was running out of ammo. Q ducked down the now empty halls. Inside the cells on either side of him were horror shows that he hoped he would eventually be able to erase from his mind. Body parts covered the beds and floors, and blood was everywhere. Q had lived through prison riots that had less gore and horror than the Hive currently had. He ducked down another hall, and there were the doors into the hospital. He needed a weapon. His gun was going to be useless soon, and he needed something he could use to fight these bastards. It was a long shot that he would be able to hold them off until help arrived, but he had to try. Provided help was ever going to arrive. He had lost his radio and had no way to communicate to anyone that he was still alive and still human. He might be able to get to a phone and call Mike, but he would have to find a way to put some distance between him and the creatures that pursued him. He heard their horrific screeching from behind him and felt his blood turn to ice. He ran into the blood-soaked hospital area that had been the place where he started this nightmare. Had that only been a few hours ago? It certainly had to have been last week, right? The place was even more of a horror show than he remembered. Blood, chunks of flesh, body parts, intestines, and organs lay everywhere. He had never seen so much blood. He slid across the floor, skidding like when he was a kid on the ice behind his Minnesota home. He could hear feet running down the hall behind him, and some more up in the ceiling from the air vents. They were going to surround him. These things were planning. Somehow they had plans, and that terrified him more than the thought that these things were just mindless dead bodies. They may not have been the swiftest thinking creatures around, but they were clever enough to outflank Q and his people and get the upper hand. Q checked his weapon. The magazine was half full at best. He wouldn't be able to take out more than a few of these things. He switched to single shot instead of bursts and hoped that he could aim. They had overwhelming numbers, though, and he knew that it was tough to be calm and cool and aim when there were hundreds of arms and legs and gnashing teeth. He looked around the medical area. Sure, he knew that there would be scalpels and things that he could use, but they seemed so small. He really wished he had something like a machete or sword, but such things were outlawed here in the Hive. Maybe residents might have something like that in their Hive City homes, but this was a prison. You didn't offer prisoners that kind of temptation. He ran over to the IV pole that he had used earlier. There was still a base with the feet at the bottom. Q quickly bent the pole, jamming one end in a door. The metal bent easily, although some part of Q's brain knew that this superhuman strength was likely due to a surge of adrenaline from sheer terror. After several minutes of bending the metal back and forth, the bottom snapped off. The end of the pole was now down to a point. That was good. He then went to work on the top, removing the loops that were there for the IV bags to be hung. After another few moments, that was gone too, and he had a long pole, maybe 3 feet long, with sharp ends on either side. He didn't think it would help for long. He would have to jab the sharp end into their heads, and there was a risk it would get stuck or that he would be bitten before he could remove it and use it on another of the ghouls. He really wanted something to slash at them, maybe decapitate a few of them, but he was out of time. It felt like crafting his weapon had taken an hour, but only seconds had gone by. He stopped now, raising his gun, the pole leaning against the wall not far from where he was. He put himself into the doorway of the room behind him. If need be, he could dive back into the room and try to barricade himself in there. Again, it was an advantage of this being a prison hospital. The doors to the rooms had to also act like cell doors, so although they appeared to be made of simple wood, they were reinforced. He heard them outside the hospital. The running feet suddenly stopped. There was no sound for what seemed like a very long time. Sweat ran down into Q's eyes, and he wiped it away impatiently, trying to ignore the stinging sensation there. Then he heard rapid feet from the ceiling, the air vents bending under the weight of dozens of running ghouls. The open ceiling tiles and broken metal air vent was just a few yards down the hall to his right. At the same moment, the doors at the front burst open, and he heard dozens and dozens of running feet scampering into the medical wing, headed for the nurse's desk. They were definitely trying to surround him, and they were going to succeed. The first of them came into view near the nurse's desk. Bracing himself against the doorway, Q aimed his rifle, using the sights, and fired one shot. It caught the ghoul, a prisoner, in the forehead, and he went down. Q aimed and fired another into the eye of a former nurse, and she went down. Q aimed and fired again, hitting a guard in the side of the head. Not bad, he thought. 3 down. However, the ghouls had now figured out where he was. One of them raised a hand and pointed and let out a noise. Q shot him through the mouth and he went down, but the rest of the mob charged. Just then, dozens more of them fell out of the broken air shaft and landed in the hall. They were on him in seconds. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, The Hive. Tune in next time for The Hive, Part 8. Written by Brian W. Alaspa Narrated and produced by Ali James. Music by Vivek Abhishek. Catch up on the first 4 seasons of When the Night Comes Out now. Support us on Patreon for more terrifying content.